Smartphones, computers, and electric vehicles may be emblems of the modern world. Their rechargeable batteries are frequently powered by cobalt mined by workers laboring in slave-like conditions in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Kara, a fellow at Harvard's T.H. Chan School of Public Health and at the Kennedy School, has been researching modern-day slavery, human trafficking, and child labor for 2 decades. He says that although the DRC has more cobalt reserves than the rest of the planet combined, there's no such thing as a clean supply chain of cobalt from the country. In his new book, Cobalt Red, Kara writes that much of the DRC's cobalt is being extracted by so-called artisanal miners, freelance workers who do extremely dangerous labor for the equivalent of just a few dollars a day. You have to imagine walking around some of these mining areas and dialing back our clock centuries, Kara says. People are working in subhuman, grinding, degrading conditions. They use pickaxes, shovels, stretches of rebar to hack and scrounge at the earth in trenches and pits and tunnels to gather cobalt and feed it up the formal supply chain. Kara says the mining industry has ravaged the landscape of the DRC. Millions of trees have been cut down. The air around mines is hazy with dust and grit, and the water has been contaminated with toxic effluents from the mining processing. What's more, he says, cobalt is toxic to touch and breathe, and there are hundreds of thousands of poor Congolese people touching and breathing it day in and day out. Young mothers with babies strapped to their backs, all breathing in this toxic cobalt dust. Cobalt is used in the manufacture of almost all lithium-ion rechargeable batteries used in the world today. And while those outside of the DRC differentiate between cobalt extracted by the country's high-tech industrial mining companies and that which was dug by artisanal miners, Kara says the two are fundamentally intertwined. There's complete cross-contamination between industrial excavator-derived cobalt and cobalt dug by women and children with their bare hands, he says. Industrial mines, almost all of them, have artisanal miners working, digging in and around them, feeding cobalt into the formal supply chain. Kara acknowledges the important role cobalt plays in tech devices and in the transition to sustainable energy sources. Rather than renouncing cobalt entirely, he says people should focus on fixing the supply chain. We shouldn't be transitioning to the use of electric vehicles at the cost of the people and environment of one of the most downtrodden and impoverished corners of the world, he says. The bottom of the supply chain, where almost all the world's cobalt is coming from, is a horror show. Technically, under the law, there should not be artisanal mining taking place in any industrial mine. And yet, lo and behold, at most of the industrial mines there is some artisanal mining taking place. In some cases, predominantly artisanal mining is taking place. And the reason is it's a penny wage way to boost production. I mean, imagine you're in a part of the world where there are millions of people who barely get $1 or $2 a day, who are grindingly poor and will accept almost any labor arrangement just to survive. Well, you put them in a tight pit, cram them with 10,000 other people, and pay them a couple of dollars, and they'll produce thousands of tons of cobalt per year for almost no wages. And so that's not legal, but it's happening. Imagine an entire population of people who cannot survive without scrounging in hazardous conditions for $1 or $2 a day. There is no alternative there. The mines have taken over everything. Hundreds of thousands of people have been displaced because their villages were just bulldozed over to make place for large mining concessions. So you have people with no alternative, no other source of income, no livelihood. Now add to that the menace in many cases of armed forces pressuring people to dig, parents having to make a painful decision. Do I send my child to school, or do we eat today? And if they choose the latter, that means bringing all their kids into these toxic pits to dig, just to earn that extra 50 cents or $1 a day. That could mean the difference between eating or not. So in the 21st century, this is modern-day slavery. It's not chattel slavery from the 18th century where you can buy and trade people and own title over a person like property. But the level of degradation, the level of exploitation is on par with old-world slavery. I spoke with many families whose children, husbands, spouses had suffered horrific injuries. Oftentimes, digging in these larger open-air pits, there are pit wall collapses. Imagine a mountain of gravel and stone just avalanching down on people, crushing legs and arms, spines. I met people whose legs had been amputated, who had metal bars in where their legs used to be. And then the worst of all is what happens in tunnel digging. There are probably 10,000 to 15,000 tunnels that are dug by hand by artisanal miners. None of them have supports, ventilation shafts, rock bolts, anything like that. And these tunnels collapse all the time, burying alive everyone who is down there, including children. It's a demise that is almost impossibly horrific to imagine, and yet I met mothers pounding their chests in grief, talking about their children who had been buried alive in a tunnel collapse. And these stories never get out of the Congo. People just don't know what's happening down there. There's money to be made in every corner and every direction, and you've got these militias. Sometimes they're called commandos, and they will abduct children, traffic children, recruit children from even other parts of the Congo. I met children who had come from hundreds of miles away and have been brought through militia networks down into the copper cobalt mines to dig. And as they dig and earn their dollar or two, that's what funds these militia groups. So children are the most heavily exploited of all the people down there. They're the most vulnerable and oftentimes trafficked and exploited in some cases in very violent circumstances. Corruption is a big part of the problem. That's what allows so much of this abuse to persist. And the thing is, imagine the Congo. It's a war-torn, deeply impoverished nation that has been subjected to generations of pillage and ransacking going all the way back, now centuries, to the slave trade. And so, when big foreign stakeholders come waving around large sums of money, it's not a long stretch of the imagination to see that there would be corruption. The first democratically elected president of the Congo in 1960, Patrice Lumumba, made a pledge that the country's immense mineral riches and resources would be used for the benefit of the people who live there. And in short order, within 6 months, he had been deposed, assassinated, chopped to pieces, dissolved in acid, and replaced with a bloody dictator, a corrupt dictator who would keep the minerals flowing in the right direction. So if you don't play ball with the power brokers at the top of the chain and with the global north, Patrice Lumumba showed what's the outcome, what will happen. And I think that's also a part of this lesson that we need to understand historically when we talk about things like corruption.